Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The fog that evening hung over London like a curtain left half-drawn, muffling the steady clop of hooves and turning the street lamps into pale, floating moons. It was on such a night that an event occurred which, for several days, sent the more sensational newspapers into paroxysms of speculation and placed Scotland Yard in its most uncomfortable posture, one of public embarrassment. I had, by providence, a vantage not from the press gallery, but from the nearest circle of friendship, for the telegram that drew me to Baker Street came scant hours after the first discovery. At 8:15, Mr. Percival Ashcroft, a gentleman of fortune, whose family held a grand townhouse in Grosvenor Square, gave a small dinner to a dozen intimates. Music followed, then cards, and at 11 the company descended to the old ballroom, long unused for a novelty Ashcroft was keen to display, a newly restored mechanical orchestrion, salvaged from the continent and made to play a Strauss waltz with brass pipes and a nest of bells. Servants lit additional sconces, and a workman, an honest fellow named Pinner, was sent to pry open a sealed wall niche, where, so family tradition had it, a mirrored alcove once stood. The gentleman desired the alcove for the orchestrion, believing the reflections would lend the contraption more sparkle. It was Pinner's chisel that first struck hollow, and his mallet, on the second blow, broke through horsehair and plaster to an airless cavity. The company, drawn as any company will be to the sound of breaking stone, gathered around as he widened the wound. From within the niche there slid forward, not collapsed nor toppled, but glided with an eerie deliberation, a human skeleton, articulated and entire, its bones coated from skull to metatarsal in a skin of beaten gold. One of the ladies screamed. The footman dropped his taper, and a blue flame raced along spilled spirits upon the floor before being stamped out. The skeleton came to rest upon its side, a gaudy mockery of the human form, its empty sockets reflecting points of candlelight like a jester's eyes. On the breastbone lay what looked to be a signet, or rather the impression of one, for the gold leaf had taken there a deeper cast, as if a seal had been pressed upon it while the metal was soft. Some declared it an emblem, others saw only wrinkles of the gilding. As for Ashcroft, he swore a sacred oath that no living soul in his household had knowledge of that grim tenant. The ballroom, he insisted, had been shut for 20 years. Inspector Lestrade, who arrived with his usual briskness and a pair of constables in tow, was at once confronted with difficulties of a kind to stir his temper. The niche, though sealed in the present generation, showed carpentry older than Ashcroft's father, hinges and a concealed latch corroded beyond use, a dust so fine within the cavity that a single breath sent it out in clouds. There were no recent footprints upon the panelled floor. Behind the orchestrion, which had only that day been rolled in, and the windows were locked with the old wedge fastenings common in better houses, if murder there had been, it seemed not of yesterday, nor of last year. Yet the gold, the gold, had the brightness of new work, with none of that green decay we associate with long-abused metal. The contrast gave rise to the first of many contradictions. Either the skeleton had long lain there and the gilding was old, or the skeleton was old and the gilding new. Neither alternative sat easily with the dust and the closure of the niche. Lestrade did what any conscientious officer must. He sent for the yard photographer, took statements from each guest, and had the servants assembled for inspection. It is not easy to question a rank of retainers while the upper 10,000 fan themselves by the mantle and pronounce opinions in undertones. The butler, a square man named Goff, swore to his master's truth the ballroom had not been used since the morning years of Lady Ashcroft's illness. The housemaid who tended that floor dusted only the corridor beyond, never the locked room. Pinner, the workman, accounted for his tools down to the last wedge. The gilded skeleton, when lifted by the constables to a sheet, kept its joints with a sickening fidelity, as though some enchanter had frozen a dancer mid-capriole. Here, too, was another curiosity. A faint perfume, sweet yet foreign, clung to the bones. One of the ladies, a Mrs. Valerian, declared it to be a tar of some Persian flower, though there were dissenting nostrils that thought it merely the odour of the glue sizing used under gold leaf. Lestrade made a note and frowned. He had been frowning since the first glimpse. "The devil of it," he said at last, "is that no one can have got him in there of late. And if he's been there these 20 years, why is he shining like a sovereign struck this morning?" To this conundrum was added a second, discovered by a constable who, poking gently among the plaster rubble, brought forth a small disc of wax no larger than a shilling. Upon it was the clear impression of a signet ring, a stag couchant beneath a coronet. Ashcroft's face at sight of it went ashen. He begged a word with Lestrade in private, and the two withdrew to the alcove of the long windows, exchanging short, rapid sentences. When they returned, Lestrade's frown had deepened into that dogged look he wears when public consequence intrudes upon his duty. "Doctor," he said to the house at large, "the remains will be conveyed to the yard for examination. Mr. Ashcroft, I'll have to ask that the room remain closed and that your guests provide me their directions. No one is to leave the city without word to me." "Is it a crime, Inspector?" asked Mrs. Valerian, her fan trembling. Lestrade hesitated. "If it is not, madam, it is an abomination." By midnight the house stood as silent as a tomb, the gilded skeleton born. Away, the niche gaping like a missing tooth. A yellow notice, pasted by a constable with paste that forever ruins good panelling, proclaimed the room under police authority. Ashcroft, in a tremor, poured brandy for those who remained. The company dispersed in twos and threes, whispering the word coronet, running among them like a spark along a fuse. It was at 1:30 that my own rest at Kensington was interrupted by the wire. "If at liberty, pray call at once. Case of singular character. Lestrade requests our participation. S.H." I confess I regarded this with a mixture of dread and fascination, for there was a chill about the tale already forming in the city's clubs, a noble's badge, a golden corpse, a shuttered room in a respectable square. I dressed and hired a cab at once, bearing the telegram in my pocket as if it were a passport to some underworld. The fog was thick in Baker Street, and I found Mrs. Hudson in wrappers, indignant but resigned, for my friend's habits had trained her to expect visitors at all hours. In the room upstairs there burned that concentrated glow I have often remarked, a lamplight made more intense by the shade, a coal fire at the dog's end of the grate, the long chemistry table in ordered disarray, and, stretched at his length upon the settee, with his hands steepled and eyes closed, Sherlock Holmes himself. At the table sat Lestrade, coffee before him, his hat upon his knees, and his gaze fixed upon an object wrapped in sacking. "You are prompt as ever, Watson," said Holmes without opening his eyes. "Sit. You come from Kensington. Your cabman chews Indian leaf. The smell clings like a careless argument." "Holmes," said Lestrade, half rising, "if you can make light of this, you are a braver man than I." He indicated the sacking with a miserable little flourish. "We found it within the rubble. Heaven help us, it makes no sense at all." Holmes opened his eyes then, grey and keen, and for an instant there was upon his face that fierce, hawk-like interest which no opera nor violin could ever kindle so brightly. "On the contrary," he murmured, "it makes a most exquisite nonsense. And exquisite nonsense, Inspector, is merely sense arranged by a mischievous hand." He drew back the sacking. Something glinted within. The night outside pressed against the panes. My friend leaned forward, and the first act of the most singular affair of the Gilded Skeleton began in earnest. Holmes leaned closer to the object wrapped in sacking, his fingers delicately untying the coarse twine with a kind of quiet precision that bespoke his concentration. Lestrade, now perched at the edge of his chair, could not conceal his anxiety, his eyes darting back and forth between the cloth and the detective. As the sacking was peeled back, the object inside became visible, its outline unmistakable even in the dim light of the study. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, no more than 6 inches long, with ornate brass hinges that gleamed faintly in the glow of the fire. Holmes, his usual disdain for mystery in the form of material objects, momentarily abated, inspected it closely, turning it in his hands, his sharp eyes catching every detail. The box had the markings of old craftsmanship, not the cheap imitation of some modern-day artisan, but the kind of quality you would expect from an artist whose hands had been tempered by decades of experience. "It's curious," Holmes muttered, barely loud enough for us to hear. "The work is unmistakably of the late 18th century, but the wear is inconsistent. This was not left to time's embrace. It has been placed carefully in that corner." I leaned forward to examine the box with him. The brass hinges, as Holmes had mentioned, seemed to have been polished recently. Too recently. The wear on the edges of the box, however, showed age, though not as much as one would expect. There were faint scuff marks along the corners, but no dust or grime, which would have been expected had it been hidden in such a place for a long time. Lestrade had been quiet for a moment, as though trying to understand the implications of what he was seeing. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" he asked, his voice betraying a note of both frustration and fascination. Holmes continued his meticulous examination of the box. He ran his fingers along its edges, testing the give of the wood as if feeling for some hidden mechanism. His expression remained unreadable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, Holmes's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "This," he said slowly, "is precisely the type of object that a man like Ashcroft would never have expected to be found in his own home." Lestrade looked confused. "But it was found in the niche inside the ballroom. What has it to do with Ashcroft?" Holmes's eyes glinted with the first real spark of excitement I had seen in him all night. He stood abruptly, pacing back and forth before the fireplace, still holding the box. "Consider, my dear Lestrade, the nature of the object itself. It was placed carefully in that niche, hidden away from all the guests and all those who might have had access to that room. And yet it is not the object itself that is the most telling, but the purpose behind its concealment." I could see that Lestrade was struggling to follow the detective's reasoning. "Purpose? What do you mean?" Holmes stopped pacing and turned sharply to face Lestrade. "The question, Lestrade, is not why the box was hidden in the niche, but why it was placed there at all. The Gilded Skeleton, an object of no small interest, was discovered in that same niche. But this box, this carefully crafted box, was hidden beneath it. Clearly it was placed there to avoid discovery by anyone who might inspect the skeleton. The question we must ask is why, and more importantly, who would go to such lengths to hide something so meticulously?" Lestrade's brow furrowed as he considered Holmes's words. He opened his mouth to speak, but Holmes raised a hand to silence him. "And before you ask, the answer is not that Ashcroft himself hid it. No, Ashcroft may be a man of some means, but he is hardly a criminal mastermind. The key, I believe, lies in the motive for hiding something so carefully, and in the fact that the box itself bears signs of manipulation, of a person with knowledge of the interior workings of Ashcroft's own house." I could see the detective's mind whirring. each step of the puzzle clicking into place. He looked at me then, his eyes intense, and I could almost hear the faint hum of his intellect as he turned his thoughts over. "It is clear to me now, Watson," he said, his voice low and controlled, "that our mystery is not just about the gilded skeleton or the oddities of Ashcroft's home. It is a deeper case, a case that involves secrets long buried beneath the veneer of respectability. Ashcroft's position as a wealthy gentleman and the fine nature of his family's history provides the perfect cover for something far more sinister. The key to the case, I suspect, lies within the walls of this very house, and we have only just begun to peel back the layers." Lestrade's face betrayed a mixture of awe and skepticism. "And what do you suggest we do next, Holmes? This could all be a clever ruse by someone to throw us off the scent." Holmes did not flinch at the inspector's doubt. "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, Lestrade. If there is one thing I know, it is that no deception, no matter how clever, ever succeeds in the long term. We are dealing with a case that is as carefully constructed as the box itself. And the true mastermind behind this scheme, whoever they are, has left us a trail of breadcrumbs, leading us closer and closer to the truth." He turned to the table and carefully placed the box down, looking at it once more with the sharp gaze of a man who could see far beyond its simple surface. "We must return to Ashcroft's home," Holmes continued, "and examine it once more, not merely the ballroom, but the entire house. Only then will we be able to uncover the true story behind this gilded skeleton." The fire crackled quietly in the background as Lestrade and I exchanged glances. The weight of the mystery had only deepened, and I could feel the tension in the room growing. The case was far from over, and the twists and turns were only beginning to reveal themselves. As Holmes gathered his coat and hat, ready to leave for Ashcroft's house, I could not help but wonder how much deeper this mystery would go. What secrets were hidden in the walls of that old townhouse? And who exactly was behind the elaborate ruse that had brought us here? It was clear that for Sherlock Holmes the game was well and truly afoot. Holmes's carriage cut through the thick London mist like a blade through gauze, the clip-clop of hooves muffled by the swirling fog that clung to the gas-lit streets. I sat opposite him, watching his lean features half lit by the flickering street lamps as we passed beneath them. His gaze was distant, his mind evidently absorbed in the intricate mechanism of deduction turning within. Lestrade sat beside me, occasionally shifting with impatience, his nerves plainly on edge from the events of the evening. We reached Grosvenor Square close to 3 in the morning. The Ashcroft townhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark, its facade shrouded in fog and silence. Only one lamp burned faintly within, perhaps left by a servant to ward off the gloom. Holmes stepped down first, his long coat flowing like a shadow, and gestured for us to follow. Inside, the house was unnervingly quiet. The scent of brandy and smoke still lingered from the evening's chaos. A single constable stood guard near the ballroom door, his eyes heavy with fatigue. He straightened at our approach and nodded nervously to Lestrade. Holmes's gaze swept the hall, noting every detail, the faint scuff of a boot on the marble floor, the smudge of plaster near the doorframe, the uneven gleam of the brass handle. "Even the walls," Holmes murmured, "seem reluctant to reveal their secrets." He entered the ballroom without waiting for permission. The place was as we had left it, the gaping niche at the far end like a wound in the house's memory. Dust motes drifted in the air where the constables had disturbed it earlier. The gilded skeleton, of course, was gone, but the impression it left behind, on the floorboards, the guests' nerves, and the very air, remained palpable. Holmes knelt near the niche, pulling from his pocket a magnifying lens and a thin rod with a looped end. "Observe, Watson," he said softly, gesturing toward the lower right of the alcove. I crouched beside him and followed his gaze. There, in the wood, were faint indentations, parallel marks no longer than a thumb, barely visible to the naked eye. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "An imprint left by a wooden brace," Holmes replied without hesitation. "This niche once contained a hinged panel, likely part of a mechanism to conceal or reveal it at will. Someone of engineering skill had altered it. Recently, I should add. The marks are sharp, not blunted by time." "Then the skeleton's discovery was not accidental?" I suggested. "Precisely. The mechanism had been sealed deliberately and reopened only days ago. The one who did so either knew what was hidden or sought something else entirely." Lestrade, still standing at the threshold, grunted. "Then we're dealing with someone inside the house? A servant, perhaps?" Holmes's expression tightened. "Not necessarily. Consider, Inspector, that access to this ballroom has been restricted for 20 years. No servant could have entered without notice. Whoever tampered with this wall had means, time, and motive. I should wager our culprit is neither servant nor tradesman, but someone with a vested interest in the family's history." He rose and turned his attention to the spot where the gilded skeleton had lain. From his coat he drew a small vial of clear liquid and sprinkled a few drops upon the floorboards. A faint shimmer appeared in the firelight, a residue barely perceptible. Holmes dipped a cloth into the shimmer and brought it close to his nose. "Gold dust," he announced. "But not from the original gilding. This was applied recently, too recently to belong to a skeleton entombed for decades. Whoever performed this macabre work did so within the last month." Lestrade looked startled. "Then you're saying the bones were already here, but someone came and gilded them afterward?" "Indeed," Holmes replied. "And that act tells us something of the culprit's mind. The gilding was not a whim. It was a message, Inspector. A performance meant to shock and to confound. There is theatre in it, a flourish of artistry one rarely encounters in common crime. This is no act of impulse, but one of deliberate symbolism." Holmes straightened, brushing the dust from his knees. "Ashcroft's family history may hold our answers. I shall require the household records, old deeds, letters, anything pertaining to previous ownership. There is more to this skeleton than its golden mask." As if summoned by name, the sound of a door creaking drew our attention. Mr. Percival Ashcroft himself stood in the doorway, pale and drawn, his dressing gown hanging loose about him. "I heard voices," he said, his tone strained. "Inspector Lestrade told me you might return, Mr. Holmes. I cannot rest. This affair, this ghastly business, has quite undone me." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Then it would be a kindness to help us undo it further. Tell me, Mr. Ashcroft, does the emblem of a stag beneath a coronet mean anything to you?" Ashcroft's eyes flickered with unease. He hesitated before answering. "That is our family's crest. It was my grandfather's seal, used on correspondence and legal papers, but I swear I have not seen that emblem in years." Holmes's gaze did not soften. "And yet it was found pressed into the gilding of the skeleton's breast. You must see the significance." Ashcroft swallowed hard. "My grandfather, Sir Lionel Ashcroft, was a collector of peculiar things, artifacts, curiosities. Some called him eccentric, others cruel. There were rumours, whispers, that he had dealings with foreign craftsmen, men who specialized in restoration and ornamentation. But these are tales, Mr. Holmes. He died when I was a child. The ballroom has been closed ever since." Holmes turned slightly toward me. "Watson, you recall the faint scent at the scene, the Persian attar, a most distinctive perfume. Sir Lionel's dealings, I suspect, were not confined to Europe. We are looking perhaps at a crime born of obsession, not necessity." Ashcroft's face drained of colour. "You think my grandfather responsible?" Holmes shook his head. "No, I think the past is. Someone has resurrected his sins to strike at you now." The words hung in the air, like the echo of a prophecy. Ashcroft trembled, his hand gripping the doorframe for balance. Lestrade looked unconvinced, but said nothing. Holmes turned back toward the niche, his eyes gleaming with the fierce light of deduction. "We are closer than you think, gentlemen," he murmured. "Somewhere in this house lies the key, a trace of the one who gilded death itself, and I intend to find it before dawn." Holmes moved through the house with the precision of a surgeon navigating a patient's anatomy, each step deliberate, each glance dissecting the silent rooms with a kind of surgical patience. The hour had grown late, close to 4, and yet there was no hint of fatigue in his movements. Ashcroft followed him reluctantly, clutching his dressing gown tighter, as if the very air of the house had turned colder with every revelation. Lestrade trudged behind, muttering occasionally about mad theories and ghost stories, though his voice lacked conviction. We passed down a narrow corridor lined with portraits, generations of Ashcroft staring out from gilt frames, their painted eyes reflecting the lamplight with uncanny life. Holmes paused before one of the larger canvases, that of Sir Lionel himself. The old man's face, captured in oil, bore the kind of fierce dignity peculiar to a bygone era. Hawkish nose, high collar, and a slight curve of the lips that suggested self-satisfaction bordering on cruelty. Beneath the portrait, a brass plaque read, "Sir Lionel Ashcroft, 1810–1876. Holmes tilted the lamp closer. "Note, Watson, the right hand," he said quietly. "Do you see the ring?" Indeed, upon Sir Lionel's painted hand was a signet ring engraved with the very emblem we had seen impressed in wax, a stag beneath a coronet. The coincidence was too exact to ignore. Ashcroft gave a nervous laugh. "It's only the family seal, Mr. Holmes. Many of our ancestors bore it." Holmes turned his gaze upon him. "And yet you said it had not been used in years?" Ashcroft faltered, colour draining from his face. I meant that I had not used it. It vanished decades ago after my father's time. I assumed it was lost or stolen." Holmes said nothing, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. He resumed his inspection, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. Then, with an abrupt motion, he pressed one corner of the portrait. A faint click echoed in the hallway. The painting swung outward on concealed hinges, revealing a recess behind it, shallow, but deep enough to contain a small iron box. Lestrade let out a low whistle. "By heaven, Holmes, how did you—" "Observe, Inspector," Holmes interrupted, "the faint streaks of polish on the lower edge of the frame. A servant's hand would never reach that high, nor would dust accumulate evenly on a painting so regularly tended. It suggested movement. The click merely confirmed it." He extracted the box and placed it carefully upon a side table. The lock had long rusted, but Holmes drew from his pocket a small steel tool and pried it open with practiced ease. Inside lay a collection of yellowed letters bound with faded ribbon, and beneath them a folded sheet of parchment covered in spidery handwriting. Holmes scanned the letters swiftly, his eyes darting across the lines. Then he unfolded the parchment, holding it near the lamp. His expression grew sharper, almost grim. "It is as I feared," he said at last. "This is not merely a family mystery. It is the residue of a crime left festering through generations." Ashcroft stepped forward, trembling. "What do you mean, sir? What crime?" Holmes handed me the parchment. It was a contract of sorts, written in both English and broken Persian. At the bottom were 2 signatures, Sir Lionel Ashcroft and one Nadir Karim, whose title was given as Master Gilder, Shiraz. The agreement detailed the crafting of a life-sized gilded effigy, a likeness wrought in deathless metal, commissioned to commemorate a transgression unconfessed. Lestrade frowned. A gilded effigy, that sounds more like art than crime. Holmes looked at him sharply. You forget the bones, Lestrade. The skeleton was no sculpture. It was a human frame, preserved and coated with gold. This document gives us both motive and method. Sir Lionel's obsession was not art. It was immortality through macabre creation. He sought to transmute mortality into gold, to make death itself ornamental. A chill passed through the hall. Ashcroft sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. God forgive him, he murmured. There were rumours of disappearances, servants gone without word, a craftsman dismissed under strange circumstances, but I never believed. Holmes interrupted softly. And yet belief has no bearing on truth. What matters is that someone has unearthed this legacy to torment you now. The gilding was recent, the scent Eastern, the symbol pressed anew. Whoever perpetrated this wishes to bind the sins of the past to the present, perhaps even to ruin you entirely. Lestrade rubbed his chin. But who would do that? And how would they even learn of this old contract? Holmes considered. Someone who had access to your family records, perhaps one of your staff, perhaps an associate of the late Sir Lionel's dealings abroad. Tell me, Mr. Ashcroft, do you employ anyone foreign-born in your household? Ashcroft hesitated. Yes, my secretary, Mr. Reza Mirza. He handles correspondence and estate accounts. A capable fellow, quiet, diligent. I engaged him 2 years ago on the recommendation of a business acquaintance in Bombay. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And does he, by chance, wear a small ring of chased gold upon his right hand? Ashcroft blinked. Why, yes, he does. A family heirloom, he said. Holmes straightened. Then, gentlemen, I believe our gilded phantom has a living hand. The trail leads directly to your Mr. Mirza. Lestrade was already moving. I'll have him brought in for questioning at once. Holmes raised a hand. No, Inspector. To confront him now would be premature. A snake must be coaxed, not struck, if one wishes to learn the depth of its hole. Let him believe himself unobserved. I have a better plan. He moved toward the window, drawing the curtain slightly aside and peering into the fog-bound street below. At dawn, I shall require a cab to follow him discreetly. He will not know he is being watched. And Watson, pack your revolver. I have a suspicion that before the sun rises over London, we shall discover what price was truly paid for the Gilded Skeleton. Ashcroft shivered and said nothing. Lestrade muttered under his breath but obeyed. Holmes turned back from the window, his face lit faintly by the dying flame of the lamp, and in his eyes there was that fierce light of anticipation which I had come to recognize the moment when the hunt began in earnest. The first streaks of dawn were still struggling to pierce the London fog when Holmes and I stationed ourselves opposite the Ashcroft residence. The morning was bitterly cold, the damp air seemed to cling to our clothes, and the dull rhythm of carriage wheels somewhere in the distance only made the silence of Grosvenor Square more pronounced. Holmes, ever the picture of composure, stood beside me with his collar turned up, the brim of his hat shadowing his sharp features. His gaze was fixed on the doorway of the house across the street. "Patience, Watson," he murmured. "If my inference is correct, Mr. Reza Mirza will not keep us waiting long. Men burdened by guilt seldom sleep easily after midnight." His prediction proved prophetic. At precisely 6:30, the front door opened, and the figure of a man emerged, tall, slim, wrapped in a dark overcoat and carrying a small leather satchel. Even through the mist I could see the glint of a gold ring upon his right hand. He paused briefly to look up and down the empty street, then turned briskly eastward, walking at a pace too quick for leisure, yet too measured for panic. Holmes's hand came to rest lightly on my arm. "Come, Watson, keep to the opposite side and do not let him suspect pursuit." We followed him through the dim avenues of Mayfair, our steps softened by the fog-damp pavement. Mirza's path led us away from the gentility of Grosvenor Square toward less distinguished streets, a curious choice for a man of supposed refinement. Once or twice he glanced behind him, his eyes darting nervously through the mist, but Holmes, with instinctive cunning, slipped behind a brewer's cart or paused to examine a shop window until the man's suspicions abated. After nearly half an hour, Mirza stopped before an unmarked door between a shuttered tobacconist and a warehouse. He looked about him again, produced a key, and slipped inside. Holmes's eyes glittered. "There, Watson," he whispered, "lies our theatre of transformation." We approached quietly, and Holmes pressed his ear to the door. A faint metallic sound reached us, a rhythmic tapping, as of metal being worked or shaped. Holmes nodded once. "He is at his trade, the son of a Persian gilder, indeed." Without further hesitation, he produced from his pocket a thin metal instrument, inserted it deftly into the keyhole, and after a soft click, eased the door open just wide enough for us to enter. The interior was dimly lit by a single gas lamp. The room reeked of chemicals, lacquer, polish, and the unmistakable acrid odour of mercury. Against the far wall stood a workbench strewn with brushes, gold leaf, and jars of strange solutions. Mirza himself was there, bent over a wooden frame which, even in silhouette, bore the unmistakable form of a human figure. He was humming softly to himself, a tune oddly serene against the ghastly nature of his work. Holmes motioned for silence, his eyes never leaving the man's hands. Mirza adjusted the flame of a small spirit lamp, then took up a fine brush and began applying something thin, shining, and metallic upon the frame's surface. It was not until he shifted slightly that the full horror of the sight met my eyes. The frame was not wood at all, but bone, bleached and assembled with a precision both anatomical and reverential. My breath caught involuntarily. Holmes's expression did not change, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the door. "Extraordinary," he whispered, barely audible. "He continues the work of Sir Lionel himself, refining it, perfecting it." At that moment, Mirza turned abruptly, his keen eyes flashing toward the doorway. Holmes moved with astonishing speed, pushing the door fully open and stepping forward, his voice calm and cold. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer. I believe we have interrupted your artistry." For an instant, Mirza stood frozen. Then, like a startled animal, he snatched a small revolver from his pocket and fired. The report was deafening in the narrow space. Holmes ducked aside, the bullet grazing his sleeve, and before Mirza could fire again, I rushed forward, striking his arm and sending the weapon clattering across the floor. The struggle was brief, but fierce. Holmes, with a swift movement, pinned the man's wrists while I retrieved the fallen revolver. Breathing hard, Mirza ceased struggling and stared at us with defiant eyes. "You have no right," he hissed. "This is my workshop. You are trespassers." Holmes regarded him coolly. "When one gilds the dead, sir, one forfeits the protection of hospitality." The man's composure faltered. "You do not understand. I was finishing what was begun before my birth. My father was the apprentice of Sir Lionel Ashcroft. The master taught him the art of transmutation. It was not a crime, it was a craft. The Gilded Skeleton was never murder, it was creation, perfection through gold." His voice quivered with fervor, almost worship. Holmes studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Creation that required a corpse. Tell me, Mirza, whose bones have you adorned tonight?" The man's gaze flicked toward the frame, and that single movement was answer enough. Holmes approached, his hand steady, and drew aside the cloth draped over the lower half of the skeleton. A faintly glimmering surface met the lamplight. The skull was newly coated, the sheen was bright, the work fresh. Beneath the thin gold, however, the bone was unmistakably human and not ancient. "Recently deceased," Holmes murmured grimly. "The marrow's still intact. This is no relic, Watson. This is murder." Mirza's face blanched. "No, I did not kill him. The body was given to me, I swear it. I was told only to finish the gilding, to make it beautiful, to deliver it to a man who would pay in silence." Holmes's voice hardened. "And who was this man?" Mirza hesitated, then spoke barely above a whisper. "He called himself Valerian." Holmes's eyes flashed with sudden recognition. Mrs. Valerian, the lady who named the Persian scent, her husband perhaps, or her accomplice. Curious indeed. Holmes turned to me sharply. "Watson, take the revolver and stand guard. Lestrade must be informed at once. The hand that gilded may not be the hand that killed, but it holds the thread that leads straight to our murderer." As I restrained the trembling craftsman, Holmes paced before the macabre figure on the table, his mind visibly racing. "The gilded skeleton was never a symbol of art," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "It was a warning, a message in gold meant to resurface precisely when the sins of the Ashcroft name could no longer be buried, and someone with both vengeance and knowledge, has timed its unveiling with remarkable precision." Outside, the dawn had begun to pierce the fog, casting the faintest light through the grimy window panes. The gold shimmered faintly beneath it, cruel and cold. Holmes turned toward the pale glow, his expression unreadable. "The case, Watson," he said softly, "has only begun to reveal its true color, and I fear it may be darker than gold." Holmes wasted no time summoning Lestrade. Within half an hour, the inspector and 2 constables had arrived at the workshop, their expressions darkening as they took in the scene, the chemical fumes, the tools, and the ghastly gleam of gold over human bone. Mirza sat silent in a corner, his wrists bound with twine Holmes had fashioned from the man's own supply of gilder's cord. The lamplight threw uneasy shadows across his face, his eyes darting from Holmes to the half-finished skeleton on the table. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Good Lord, Holmes. It's worse than anything I've seen since the Brixton butcher. He's mad, clearly. But what in blazes does this have to do with Ashcroft's gilded corpse in Grosvenor Square?" Holmes was crouched near the table, examining a set of small glass bottles arranged in meticulous order. "Not madness, Lestrade. Devotion," he said softly. "The man's mind has been warped by inheritance. He is not the originator of this horror, but its curator, the true author, works through him." Lestrade frowned. "You mean someone else gave him these bones?" Holmes rose slowly. "Exactly. Mirza gilds, but he does not kill. His father's trade provided him the knowledge, and someone with both influence and understanding of the Ashcroft past has exploited it." He crossed to Mirza and crouched beside him. "You spoke of a man called Valerian," Holmes said quietly. "You will now tell us when and where you met him." Mirza's voice trembled. "He came a week ago. Said he represented a collector who wished for a restoration. He knew my name, my father's craft, even the story of Sir Lionel. He brought the bones himself in a sealed chest. I was to complete the work and deliver it to the ballroom at Grosvenor Square by night, through the side gate. He left gold leaf, and this—" He nodded toward a folded paper on the bench. Holmes snatched it up and spread it open. Written in a careful but oddly mechanical hand was a single instruction. "Let death shine again that old sins may speak. The stag shall judge its own." Lestrade looked baffled. "That's gibberish." "On the contrary," Holmes said, eyes alight, "it is accusation. The stag beneath the coronet, Ashcroft's emblem, judging its own blood. This was vengeance, not vanity." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Where was this Valerian to meet you after delivery?" "In an inn by the river, the King's Crossed Keys. He said he would pay there." Holmes straightened briskly. "Then we shall meet him ourselves. Lestrade, leave a man to guard this place. The skeleton stays untouched. Watson, bring your revolver. Our quarry is a man who gilds his messages with death." We left the workshop as the fog began to thin. The streets were awakening, milk carts clattering, paperboys shouting. Yet beneath the city's morning stir there lingered an air of foreboding. Holmes hailed a cab, and as we rode he spoke in quick, clipped sentences, his mind evidently moving faster than his tongue could keep pace. "Consider the sequence, Watson. Sir Lionel's secret was buried, the ballroom sealed. Only now does it emerge, when the last of the Ashcroft stands in the square. Someone has timed this carefully, knowing both family shame and public fascination would destroy Percival Ashcroft faster than any bullet." "Then this Valerian seeks to ruin him?" I asked. "Precisely, but ruin is only the surface. There is intellect behind this design. It has poetry, cruelty refined into art. He makes Ashcroft's ancestors' sin visible in gold and forces the heir to confront it." We arrived at the Crossed Keys near the river, a grim establishment whose sign creaked in the early wind. Inside, the dim light of oil lamps revealed low beams, warped floors, and a few dockworkers hunched over breakfast ale. Holmes approached the bar, his voice light, almost casual. "We're looking for a guest by the name of Valerian, arrived within the past week." The innkeeper, a stout man with a red nose, frowned thoughtfully. "A gentleman of that name's been staying here. Keeps to himself. Room at the back, first floor. Paid in advance. Quiet sort, though foreign, I think." Holmes nodded curtly. "Good. We'll introduce ourselves." Lestrade motioned to his constables, and we ascended the narrow staircase, the boards creaking beneath our feet. Outside the room, Holmes raised a hand for silence, then leaned to the door. "He's awake," he murmured. "Moving about, likely packing." He knocked once, no reply. A second, louder rap, and the faint scrape of metal from within. Without hesitation, Holmes drove his shoulder against the door. The lock splintered and we burst inside. The room was empty save for an open window and a faint scent of the same Persian attar that had haunted the ballroom. On the table lay a travelling case half-packed, and beside it a folded document sealed with red wax. Holmes crossed swiftly, tore it open, and read aloud. "You are late, Mr. Holmes, but then the past is always one step ahead. Seek your answers where gold meets water, and you may glimpse the truth before it sinks." Lestrade swore under his breath. "He's gone, probably out the window to the docks." Holmes's expression was grimly satisfied. "Not gone, just leading us. Gold meets water, Inspector. Where does gold meet water in London?" Lestrade hesitated. "The Mint Wharf, the old bullion warehouse by the Thames." Holmes's smile was thin. "Just so. Valerian has staged his finale by the river. He means us to follow." He turned toward the open window. "He's confident, Watson, too confident. That is where his mistake will show. Lestrade, ready your men. We go to the river, and this time we meet the man who gilds skeletons, not for art, but for retribution." As we descended the stairs, the first full light of morning broke through the fog, pale and cold. Holmes paused at the door, his silhouette sharp against the glare. "This Valerian fancies himself a judge," he said quietly. "But every man who plays at justice forgets one truth: the noose is impartial." And with that, he stepped into the waking city, his stride quick, his eyes fixed toward the unseen river that waited with secrets beneath its glimmering surface. The ride to the river was swift and silent, the wheels of the cab whispering over cobblestones slick with early mist. Holmes sat forward, his fingers drumming against his knee in quiet rhythm, his gaze unfocused yet fierce. Lestrade, opposite him, kept one hand on his revolver and the other gripping the door handle, as though bracing himself for what awaited. I could feel the tension between them, two men of opposite temperaments bound by one pursuit. The air itself seemed to tighten as we neared the Thames, its cold breath seeping through the carriage like the exhalation of something ancient and watchful. When we arrived at the Mint Wharf, the fog had thickened again, rising in slow columns from the water like ghostly smoke. The old bullion warehouse loomed against the grey horizon, its windows shuttered, its brickwork streaked with years of neglect. The faint clang of a distant ship's bell carried across the river, mingling with the creak of ropes and the lap of unseen waves against the pilings. Holmes stepped out first, his eyes scanning the structure with the quick, assessing sharpness of a hawk sighting its prey. "Note the padlock on the side door, Watson," he said, pointing toward a rusted chain that hung loose from its bolt. "Broken, and recently. Our man has been here since dawn." Lestrade signalled his men to spread out, covering the rear entrances. Holmes, meanwhile, crouched to examine the ground near the threshold. The muddy earth bore faint impressions, boot tracks narrow and deep at the heel, leading into the building. He touched one lightly with his fingertips, then rose, his face unreadable. "He's alone," he murmured, "and he's waiting for us. That, Watson, is the mark of a man who believes himself untouchable." Inside, the air was dense with the scent of iron and salt. Shafts of pale light filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating motes of dust that drifted lazily through the gloom. Crates and barrels stood stacked in forgotten rows, and somewhere deeper in the darkness, a slow, metallic dripping echoed, rhythmic and steady. It was the kind of place where time itself seemed reluctant to move. We followed the trail of footprints across the uneven floor until we reached the center of the warehouse. There, beneath a broken skylight, stood a makeshift platform of wooden planks. Upon it, a tarp-draped shape glimmered faintly in the dim light. Beside it, calm and poised, stood the man we sought. He was tall, dressed impeccably in a dark coat, his silver hair neatly brushed back. His face bore the refined lines of a gentleman, yet his eyes were cold, bright, and utterly without warmth. He looked up as we approached and smiled with the calmness of a host greeting expected guests. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said softly. "You are punctual. I had wondered if your curiosity would outweigh your caution." Holmes's expression did not change. "You are Valerian?" The man inclined his head slightly. "Among other names." Lestrade stepped forward, revolver raised. "You'll have the chance to list them all at Scotland Yard, sir. Step away."
From that platform, Valerian's smile deepened, untroubled. "Ah, Inspector Lestrade. You see only the surface of things, as always. I did not summon you here for flight, but for revelation." He gestured toward the tarp. "Remove it, if you dare. Let your inspector's courage meet what your detective's intellect already suspects." Holmes moved forward, ignoring Lestrade's warning murmur, and with a single motion pulled the covering away. Beneath it lay another skeleton, this one half gilded, half bare. But unlike the earlier specimens, the skull bore a coronet of gold leaf pressed directly into the bone, and between the ribs hung a small silver medallion engraved with the Ashcroft crest. Percival Ashcroft's crest. I felt my stomach tighten. Good heavens, I breathed. That's impossible. Holmes's voice cut through the silence, low and controlled. You mean for us to believe this is Ashcroft himself? Valerian's tone was smooth as silk. Believe or understand, it matters little. The sins of the fathers seldom die, Mr. Holmes. They rot beneath the surface until someone grants them form again. Sir Lionel's cruelty forged a legacy of gold and death. I have merely given it a body. Lestrade's jaw clenched. You murdered Ashcroft and dressed it up in theatrics. You'll hang for it. But Valerian laughed, a sound too cold, too deliberate to be madness. Murder, Inspector? You mistake justice for crime? Percival Ashcroft came to me of his own accord. He sought absolution for his grandfather's secret. I offered him immortality, the same immortality Lionel sought for himself. He consented. I merely completed the cycle. Holmes's eyes sharpened. No man consents to his own gilded tomb unless bound by fear or persuasion. You preyed upon his guilt, and yet... He paused, stepping closer to the skeleton. His gaze drifted downward to the silver medallion. This medallion, Lestrade, it is newly struck. The edges are sharp, the engraving modern. Our friend Valerian is not merely historian, but artist and craftsman both. His hand gilds, his mind deceives. Valerian's composure flickered only slightly. You see too much, Holmes. But what you fail to see is why. Do you think me a monster? No, I am but the mirror held to an empire's face. Ashcroft's wealth was born of torment. His family's fortune was paid in blood from the East. My father was among those enslaved by Lionel's obsessions, his craft stolen, his name erased. I reclaim it now, in gold. The fury beneath his calm words sent a chill through me. Holmes stood motionless, his eyes fixed on Valerian's face. And vengeance, dressed as art, has led you here, to repeat his crime under the banner of justice. You have become the thing you despise. Valerian's smile returned, though it trembled faintly at the edges. Perhaps. But I have at least given the dead their voice. He reached into his coat pocket and
withdrew a small vial the same kind Mirza had used in his workshop, and held it aloft. With this, he said softly, the cycle ends. Lestrade shouted, "Drop it!" and lunged forward, but in the same instant Holmes moved faster. With a quick strike, he caught Valerian's wrist and twisted. The vial shattered against the floor, releasing a hiss of acrid fumes. The man cried out, staggering backward. The constables rushed in, pinning him before he could flee. Holmes stepped aside, coughing lightly as the smoke dispersed. "Mercuric solution," he muttered. "Enough to poison a dozen men. A final flourish to gild his own death, perhaps." Valerian struggled, his voice hoarse now. "You think you've stopped it, Holmes, but you cannot erase what's been uncovered. The world will know. The Ashcroft name will burn brighter in infamy than ever it did in gold." Holmes regarded him quietly. "Perhaps, but it will burn alone. The living need not carry the weight of the dead forever." As Lestrade's men led Valerian away, the first shafts of sunlight broke through the fog, striking the gilded skeleton on the platform. It glowed faintly in the cold light, a grotesque monument of vanity and vengeance. Holmes turned his face from it, his expression unreadable. "The case is finished," I said softly. Holmes's voice, when it came, was low and distant. "No, Watson, the case is concluded, but such things are never finished. Gold may cover decay, but it cannot conceal it." We left the warehouse in silence, the river behind us whispering its eternal song, a song that seemed, for a fleeting moment, to echo with the sound of gilded bones beneath the water's surface. The ride back from the river was a quiet one. Even Lestrade, who was usually quick to declare a case solved once the handcuffs had clicked, seemed uneasy, as though something about the morning's events refused to sit comfortably in his mind. Holmes sat rigidly upright beside me, his eyes unfocused, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the carriage door. There was none of the triumph that usually followed the unmasking of a culprit. Instead, a heavy silence hung between us, broken only by the occasional rattle of the wheels over the cobblestones. When we reached Baker Street, the lamps were being extinguished for daylight and the fog had begun to lift. Inside, Holmes went directly to the window, drawing the curtain aside to let in the pale light. His silhouette was sharp against it, tall and unmoving. I busied myself with lighting the fire, more for comfort than warmth. Lestrade remained standing, his bowler hat twisting in his hands. "Well," he began at last, "that's one for the books, Holmes. A family curse, an artist turned avenger, and a gilded corpse. You've got your man. Scotland Yard will see that he never works his craft again." Holmes didn't turn. "Indeed, Lestrade, yet I wonder which man you believe I've caught." The inspector frowned. "Valerian, of course?" The man admitted his part, and the evidence... "The evidence," Holmes interrupted sharply, "is too perfect." He spun around, his eyes gleaming now with that peculiar light I knew well. The restless fire that came when his mind refused the simplicity of an answer. "Every step of this case has been arranged with deliberate precision. Each revelation placed before us like bait. The Gilded Skeleton, the family papers, the Persian craftsman, even Valerian's confession, it all fits too neatly. There is an unseen hand directing the sequence, Lestrade, and that hand is still free." Lestrade looked incredulous. "You mean to say there's another, after all we've seen?" "I mean to say," Holmes replied, "that Valerian was a performer on a stage built by someone else. His role was vengeance, but whose vengeance truly guided his actions?" I glanced toward him. "You think he was manipulated?" "Beyond doubt," Holmes said. "His hatred of the Ashcrofts was genuine, but his method, his precision, his timing, all bear the mark of orchestration. Consider, who placed that first skeleton in Ashcroft's ballroom? Valerian could not have entered unnoticed, and yet the niche was reopened and resealed under the very nose of a household filled with guests. That act required both access and authority." Lestrade scowled. "You're not suggesting Ashcroft himself?" Holmes's lips thinned. "I am suggesting that Ashcroft's death may not have been as voluntary as Valerian claimed. Men consumed by guilt do not arrange their own theatrical executions. They seek forgiveness, not spectacle. The medallion upon the skeleton's ribs was new. Watson noted that himself. It was meant to mark not the dead man's repentance, but his replacement." The inspector looked thoroughly uncomfortable. "Then who in blazes could manage all that? The servants were clean, the house sealed." Holmes's gaze drifted to the fire. "Not all the household, Lestrade. There was one who moved freely between the rooms, who spoke first of the Persian scent, who lingered near the scene before the constables arrived." He looked up sharply. "Mrs. Valerian?" I felt a chill. "The lady from the dinner?" "The same. Her presence was dismissed as coincidence, but nothing in this case has been left to chance. She identified the attar when no one else could, and yet she claimed no prior knowledge of Persia. She fainted at the sight of the skeleton. Too quickly, I recall. It was a reaction performed for the room, not for herself. And when she recovered, her first question was not about the horror, but whether the police would investigate the seal on the breastplate. Tell me, Watson, what sort of guest notices the emblem before the corpse? Lestrade exhaled sharply. You think she's the true mastermind? Holmes's tone softened. Think? No, Lestrade, I am certain, but proof, as ever, must precede accusation. Mrs. Valerian played her part well, first as a guest, then as a witness, then as a name whispered by her so-called husband. She has constructed the entire illusion around grief and legacy, and we, like her victims, have walked through her theatre as spectators. He crossed to his writing desk, flipping open his notebook and sketching swiftly. Observe the pattern, the resurrection of an ancestral crime, the use of foreign craftsmanship, the orchestration of spectacle. This is not the impulse of a lone artist. It is the mind of someone who understands society's fascination with sin and the macabre. She has turned justice into art, and art into vengeance. Lestrade rubbed his temple. You'll forgive me, Holmes, but this sounds like a ghost story. Holmes looked up, his eyes hard. A ghost, yes, but a living one. Valerian's so-called wife never existed in the registry of London households. The name appears only in his own documents, which were, I now suspect, forgeries. She was never his wife, but his controller. She fed him the story of Ashcroft's grandfather, guided his hand in the gilding, and ensured his arrest when the time came. A clean exit, her puppet imprisoned, her vengeance complete. I found my voice at last. But what could drive her to such extremes? Holmes turned toward the window again, watching the pale sunlight filter through the fog. Blood, he said quietly, and the memory of it. If I am correct, Mrs. Valerian is no stranger to the Ashcroft line. She is descended from one of the servants who vanished under Sir Lionel's employ, the missing apprentices whose names were erased. Her father may have been among those sacrificed to his experiments in gilding. This is her retribution, carried out with elegance and patience. She sought not merely to punish, but to mirror his work, to make Ashcroft's house relive its original sin, bone by bone, frame by frame. Lestrade's jaw tightened. Then she's still out there. Holmes nodded. And she will not stay hidden for long. The spider that spins such a web does not abandon it easily. She will linger, to watch the aftermath, perhaps even to mourn her own handiwork. That is where we shall find her. He turned to me suddenly. Watson, we return to Grosvenor Square tonight. The police will keep to their patrols, but we shall keep to the shadows. There is one final act left to play, and I intend to see it performed to its curtain. Lestrade's voice was low. You think she'll come back to the house? Holmes's gaze flickered with that same fierce, bright certainty. She will come back to admire the masterpiece she created. All artists do. He drew the curtain once more, shutting out the light, and the room fell into dimness. In that half-shadow I could see only the sharp profile of his face and the faint smile that touched his lips, not of triumph, but of anticipation. The hunt, though narrowed, was not yet over. And somewhere in the waking streets of London, the woman who had gilded vengeance in gold was waiting to return to the scene of her crime. Night settled over Grosvenor Square with the soft inevitability of a curtain falling at the theatre, the lamps outside blooming into modest halos and the pavements taking on a faint, pewter sheen. Holmes and I entered the Ashcroft townhouse by the mews door with Lestrade's reluctant consent and the aid of a skeleton key that had doubtless known better days. The constable posted at the front was told to maintain his station and admit no one. Our work required the quiet of an empty stage. Holmes moved through the hall with a lantern shaded to a slit, the beams sliding over balustrade and panel like a blade of light. He paused at the ballroom threshold, head inclined, as though listening to the house breathe. There, he whispered, indicating the dark square of the reopened niche. Every artist returns to her frame. He knelt at the baseboard and, with a thin knife, prized up 2 short tacks he had planted earlier, and every frame deserves a finishing touch. From his pocket he produced The new silver medallion we had recovered at the river, the Ashcroft crest, sharp as a fresh wound, and placed it half hidden in the dust, as if dropped in haste. "Bait," he murmured. "She will not be able to resist correcting another's arrangement." We doused the lantern and took our positions, Holmes in shadow, behind the long velvet drape, I between the French windows where the fog pressed its cold face to the glass. Lestrade, noiseless for once, stood back along the wall, his revolver in his hand and his patience, for once, equal to the hour. Time thickened. A carriage clattered somewhere far off, a coal grate settled with a sigh. Holmes was a statue, all thought and no motion. I could make out only the pale angle of his cheek and the faint shine at his eyes. It was near midnight when the latch clicked faintly below, and a breath of outside air crept up the stair like a guilty thought. A figure moved along the corridor, light, certain, unhurried, and paused at the ballroom door. She entered without striking a light, as if the room's darkness had been measured to her step. Even in silhouette I recognized the carriage of her head, the assured economy of her motion. Mrs. Valerian crossed the floor straight to the niche and lowered herself to one knee. In the hush I heard the smallest intake of breath as she saw the medallion. Her fingers hovered, drew back, hovered again, then closed around it with a tremor of proprietary resolve. Holmes stepped from the curtain and reached the niche in 3 silent strides. "A collector's impulse, madam," he said evenly, "to retrieve what must belong to the pattern." She did not start. She simply rose and turned, the lamplight from the street laying a soft rim upon her cheek and showing a face composed past habit, past effort. "You place your pieces—"
"Neatly, Mr. Holmes," she replied. "But you mistake the board. The medallion is not the point. It is the period at the end of a sentence already written." Lestrade advanced, iron in his voice. "Name, madam." "I have worn too many to favour any single one," she said, almost gently. "But if you require a sound to set against your charge, use mesmerizing. It belonged to my mother before a British steward wrote it backwards in a ledger." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Then, Mrs. Razi, we will have the truth. Percival Ashcroft, is he dead?" Her gaze flickered toward the dark mouth of the niche, then back. "He is as dead as his crest," she answered. But even as she formed the words, Holmes's hand came up in a small, dismissive motion. "No," he said, "not dead. The skeleton at the wharf bore the signs of a healed tibial fracture absent in Mr. Ashcroft, whose limp is of the hip and recent. The cranial sutures bespoke a man 10 years younger. You gilded a substitute and pinned a lie to its ribs, cleverly, but not past correction. Where is he?" For the first time her composure quivered. Not the florid collapse of the drawing-room faint, but the smallest falter in an otherwise musician's timing. "You mistake me," she said, though the certainty had thinned in her tone. "I stage what history refuses to show. I do not write new names upon bones." Holmes's voice softened, and with it came a gravity that always moved me more than any triumph. "Yet you edited the past to master the present. You set Valerian to gild and to rage, arranged his letter at the crossed keys, and let him taste the vanity you despise. You led him to the river as you have led us to this room. You will lead us now to the living man you mean to use as your final flourish." Lestrade took a half step, but Holmes's raised finger held him. The woman's eyes had gone from iron to dusk. They travelled in that instant through decades I could not see, across a sea perhaps, and over ledger pages our city had taught the world to write. She drew from her sleeve a small packet and tossed it with a dry whisper onto the hardwood near the niche. The twine broke. Letters slid out, Parchment and cheaper paper, Persian and English, names and sums, signatures and seals. Sir Lionel's odious hand in one, an overseer's in another, and across one bottom margin a name the colour of grief. Yusuf Razi, indenture renewed. My father, she said, and my mother's brother. Ashcroft's men signed the ocean into their lungs and called it commerce. I have made of their silence a voice. Is that so monstrous? Holmes bent, glanced and straightened. It is not monstrous to grieve, madam. It is monstrous to gild grief upon an innocent man's skull. Where is Ashcroft? She held him a long moment, then exhaled as if yielding a claim no court could recognize. Below, she said, the coal vault beyond the scullery. He is bound, not broken. He was to awaken to his grandfather's history and choose his ending. Valerian would have made it gold. I would have made it public. You have spoiled both. Lestrade was already moving. 2 minutes later, his shout rose from the service passage, and we were down the back stair in a fury of echoing steps. In the vault, by the weak glow of a yard lantern, we found Percival Ashcroft on a pallet, wrists raw from the cords, face pale and lips dry, but pulse steady beneath my fingers. He stirred as I splashed water upon his brow, and when his eyes opened, they fastened not upon me, but upon the man who stood behind my shoulder. Mr. Holmes, he whispered, shame and relief fighting in his throat. I dreamt I had died in my own house. You were made to pose for it, Holmes returned. Fortunately, the artist had not laid her final leaf. He straightened. Lestrade, bring him upstairs. Keep him from the ballroom. Back in that blackened theatre of a room, Selima Razi had neither fled nor fainted. She stood where we had left her, the letters at her feet like fallen leaves. Lestrade entered last with his men and the cold manacles that end all performances. She extended her wrists before he could speak. I have arranged a confession, she said. It is more art than law, but it will do. Her eyes lifted to Holmes. You will say I erred, and you will not be wrong, but you will have to write that I was seen. That is all I have ever sought. Holmes regarded her a long while. The fog pressed once against the window and withdrew. I will write, he said quietly, what is true. Then, almost inaudibly, to himself, and what is just, where justice can be found. As they led her away, she turned once, as any artist might, to take in the room that had hosted her final composition. The niche, the dust, the medallion, glinting like a tiny moon. Holmes stooped, picked up the silver disc, weighed it in his palm and slipped it at last into his pocket. Dawn came late to Baker Street, as though the city hesitated to admit what the night had confessed. Lestrade departed. Mr. Percival was seen to by his physician, while I returned with Holmes. He spoke little on the drive, and when we arrived he did not remove his coat, but stood at the mantel with the silver medallion, turning between his fingers like a planet orbiting a hidden sun. Outside, the fog thinned, but London kept its counsel. You see, Watson, he said at last, how near grief runs to theatre when a mind directs it. She is no ghoul. She is a logician of suffering and therefore exceedingly dangerous. You will go to the yard? I asked. In due course. First, I will appear to myself. He set the medallion down and drew out the packet of letters. The pattern must be set down, lest memory gild it further. He gestured toward my notebook. Pray oblige me. I took my pen. Holmes paced, dictating as he moved, each sentence rising like scaffolding around truth. Point the first. The skeleton in the ballroom was old, but its gilding new. Gold dust upon the boards, residue of modern size, and the sweet attar none could name but one.
The discovery was engineered, an opening night for witnesses. Point the second, access, the niche brace renewed lately. A person with authority in the house reopened, displayed, and summoned the yard. She observed too much too soon. The lady who called herself Valerian played herald and critic both. Point the third, instruments. Mirza gilded bones at a river shop with leaf and solutions provided by another. He named Valerian as client, yet the script that commissioned his work matched the feminine accounts in Ashcroft's papers. Forgery thrives where mimicry hides. Point the fourth, the counterfeit at the wharf. The coronet pressed into bone, the medallion newly struck. The tibial fracture absent in Ashcroft proved substitution. The true Ashcroft lay alive beneath his own house. Point the fifth, motive, not avarice. Vengeance refined by art, not to enrich, but to expose. She forced a living heir to acknowledge an ancestor's debt before society's mirror. Valerian was her knife, Mirza her gilding, we her chorus. He stopped at the window. Morning brightened from pewter to tin. "That will serve?" he said. "Now how did she move?" "You believe she entered as a guest to scout the ground," I said. "More. She studied registries and ledgers, traced the steward who kept Lionel's books, and with those names fashioned a card acceptable at any door. She befriended a housemaid at chapel, borrowed a livery key, and walked the ballroom at noon while Ashcroft sat with his solicitor. Her letters show a mind fluent in 2 tongues and 3 stations. I felt admiration. Yet she spared Ashcroft's life. Because the living can repent, and the dead merely instruct, Holmes returned. Killing would have ended her play before the moral. She contrived terror, then confession. You saw the cords, not a strangler's knots, but clean seaman's hitches. Functional, temporary, more theatre than harm. A rap sounded. Lestrade entered, hat in hand, his face a mix of fatigue and grudging respect. "She confessed in outline," he said. "Not to murder, there's none to lay, but to conspiracy, fraud, assault, unlawful confinement, and acts our statutes do not name. The magistrate will make of it what he can." Holmes nodded. "And Ashcroft?" "Quiet as a church floor," Lestrade said. "Says he will fund pensions for descendants named in the letters and open the ballroom to the light. Whether that is sincerity or panic, I cannot tell." Holmes's mouth curved. "Let light judge. It is sterner than I." He weighed the medallion. "You see, Inspector, the sting lies in the workmanship. She copied Lionel's vice, transmutation, but turned it from immortality into indictment. She gilded not flesh, but conscience." Lestrade blew out a breath. "London will have a fortnight of headlines. I only hope your name prints smaller than hers." "My name," Holmes said, "is already too large for comfort." He turned to me. "Watson, send a note to Ashcroft advising him to place the Razi letters in trust and employ an honest steward to search his grandfather's ventures. There are further names to liberate from silence." Lestrade made for the door and paused. "You saw past the gold to the hand that laid it. If you ever tire of your rooms, there's a desk at the yard that could use dusting." "Dust," said Holmes, "is a thing I prefer to read." When the door closed, he stood very still, then glanced at the violin case and left it shut. Instead, he went back to the mantel and the small planet of silver. "You are thinking of her?" I said. "I am thinking," he replied, "that truth, like gold, is beaten thin so it may cover more than it should. When one finds a seam, one must risk tearing it." He looked over. "Come, Watson, there is a patient in Grosvenor Square who has waked from a nightmare. We shall see if daylight can cure what theatre began." The fog that had once hidden every shadow in Grosvenor Square now lifted, revealing the house in its unadorned truth. The ballroom, once a theatre of deception and gilded death, was shuttered, the niche sealed again with plain plaster, and the scent of Persian attar had long since faded. Yet the echo of those nights lingered in the air, as though the walls themselves still remembered the gleam of false gold and the whisper of old sins uncovered. Holmes and I returned some weeks later at Mr. Percival Ashcroft's invitation. The man had changed, his once proud bearing softened by humility, the restless arrogance replaced with something quieter, more human. He received us in the library, where morning light streamed through the tall windows and glinted not on gold, but on the simple brass fixtures newly polished by his own hand. "I am in your debt, Mr. Holmes," he said gravely. "It is a peculiar thing to have one's ruin avert one's destruction. I thought the Ashcroft name a monument. You showed me it was a tomb." Holmes smiled faintly, though his gaze wandered to the mantel where the family crest, once prominently displayed, was now absent. "Monuments crumble, Mr. Ashcroft," he said, "but if the tomb is opened, the living might yet learn from the bones within." Ashcroft inclined his head. "I have begun repairs, not to the house, but to the truth. I have returned the letters to the Razi family, or what remains of it. Funds have been set aside for their descendants. I cannot undo my grandfather's hand, but perhaps I can lessen its stain." Holmes regarded him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That is an act of conscience, sir, not of restitution. Guilt is personal, debt is historical. The first you may resolve, the second will take
generations." Ashcroft did not answer. His eyes, hollow yet clear, followed us as we took our leave, and I fancied that some part of him would forever walk those halls at night, listening for footsteps that were not his own. Outside, the London air was clean and cold. Holmes paused by the railings, the faint sound of hooves echoing along the square. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "how justice occasionally borrows the tools of the wicked to accomplish the work of the just. Mrs. Razi, Selima, was not wrong to seek balance, only mistaken in her method. Yet without her, the truth might have slept another century beneath a golden shroud." I nodded, watching the light catch on the windows of the house. "Do you pity her, Holmes?" He drew on his pipe before answering. "Pity? No, but I understand her. The line between retribution and righteousness is no thicker than the leaf of gold she so loved to lay. She sought to expose hypocrisy, and in doing so she became its final victim. That, I think, is tragedy enough." We walked in silence toward the waiting cab, the street still slick from the morning rain. As we turned into Brook Street, I glanced back. A workman was affixing new letters to the gate. Ashcroft House, to let. The name, once synonymous with power, now hung there like a relic. "Do you believe, Holmes," I ventured, "that history will judge her kindly?" He looked toward the rising sun, his face half in shadow. "History, my dear Watson, has no kindness. It remembers what is recorded and forgets what is inconvenient. It is men such as you who give mercy to the written word. Record her, then, not as a villain, nor a saint, but as one who sought light and mistook its reflection for the sun." The carriage drew up, and we climbed inside. As it carried us away, Holmes leaned back, his eyes closed, his voice no more than a murmur. "Gold deceives the eye, Watson, yet the truth beneath it endures. That is the paradox of all our little civilizations. Each, convinced its guilt, will outlast the dust." And as the cab turned into Baker Street, the morning fog began once again to descend, a soft veil reclaiming the city, as though London itself wished to hide the gleam of human folly before the day grew too bright. It was there, within that quiet greyness, that Sherlock Holmes settled once more into his habitual calm. Another case concluded, another ghost laid to rest, not with applause, but with understanding. And though the gilded skeleton was now confined to the pages of memory, I knew that its lesson would linger, unpolished and untarnished, long after even the finest gold had faded from sight.